Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short. Today we're going to be revisiting a recent Dr. Phil episode on network television. We're going to review his response and his interaction with a pro-life activist, Lila Rose, one of the best pro-life activists around, who's been advocating for the end of abortion for a long time in her young life. And she is going to argue, like all pro-life Christians believe, that human life begins at conception, at fertilization, at the moment that unique individual has their own unique DNA. That's when life begins. There is no other logical reason to demarcate human life other than when it actually begins at conception. And Dr. Phil is going to be arguing for some squishy, wishy, some time after fertilization, or he's going to basically be saying, well, nobody really knows when life begins, and so we have to allow it to begin anywhere we want it to begin, and we can allow abortion at any point that we want it to begin. And so he's going to argue the secular humanist pro-abortion position, essentially, whether he knows it or not. He's trying to be fair and balanced, and he's trying to take a middle ground and sit on the fence and say, well, I'm not going to commit to any one position, but I am going to say that every woman deserves the right to choose where she wants to make that decision, and we need to let her make that final decision. He's going to actually come down on the pro-abortion side for whatever other logic he might bring to the argument. So we're going to look at Lila Rose and Dr. Phil dialogue, and then I'm going to jump in at certain places and try to interact with their interactions. So hopefully this will introduce people who don't already know, or people who already do know, reinforce their Christian worldview in defending human life. Christians defend human life. We believe that God created all people, all races, all ethnic groups, people at all ages, people of all sizes. We believe that God created all people in His divine image. It says that in the book of Genesis. He created them male and He created them female in His image and in His likeness. It's very clear in the book of Genesis. All you have to do is go there, and it will show you that God created all people, men and women, of all ethnic groups, all sizes, all shapes, all ages, in His image. And so because of that, they deserve protection. They deserve full and equal rights as any other human being. Now, the pro-abortion side, the pro-choice side, so-called, the abortion rights activists and those who favor abortion, they don't believe that. They don't believe that a person is in the image of God at every stage of life. I guess they want to say that whenever they choose to honor life, that's when life begins. Well, that's arbitrary. That's subjective. That is not a standard that a society can be built on. So you cannot have people making life and death decisions like killing a baby whenever they feel like it. And that's what we have right now with the abortion state of condition here in the United States. Even though Roe v. Wade, that terrible, awful decision of 1973 by the Supreme Court, even though Roe v. Wade legalized abortion in all 50 states, and even though it was overturned recently, it still is the case that a woman can pretty much have an abortion whenever and wherever she wants to, because not all states protect human life. Only a handful of states right now are actually prohibiting abortion. And you can go to any state that doesn't prohibit abortion and have an abortion. And that's what women are doing right now. But that isn't enough, because the pro-abortion activists want there to be a federal law that says you cannot prohibit abortion. And so they're pushing for a national federal abortion permission law that would allow abortion in any situation, which is terrible, because it's even worse than Roe v. Wade. So as Christians, we need to be aware of these things. We need to be praying against them. And also we need to know what the arguments are so that we can explain to people who are being brainwashed by the secular news outlets, the media, secular institutions like the colleges and universities, secular institutions like the legal system and the counseling and psychological and psychiatric associations. They're all brainwashing people into thinking that abortion is simply a choice between a mother and the doctor and family, but it's not. It's actually a moral line that cannot be crossed. We cannot give citizens the right to kill other citizens. And the unborn child in the womb, although it's small, is still a citizen and cannot be deprived of its rights, not only under our Constitution, but under God, most importantly. God gives that little baby a right to life, and no human has the right to take it. So let's jump into the discussion right now and find out what these two are going to say, and I'll stop at certain points and we'll comment on that.
Ready to take effect. Trigger laws in 13 states banned abortion immediately or soon after Roe was repealed, meaning the federal ruling triggers a state law banning abortion to go into effect. Some states are already seeing legal challenges to their trigger laws, and there are more lawsuits likely to follow.
No one here is pro-death, and no one here is pro-abortion. The difference is pro-choice and pro-life.
Actually, that is not exactly true. If you are arguing that a woman has the right to kill her baby, you are pro-abortion. You are for abortion. You are in favor of abortion. You are in favor of the operation, the procedure, whatever you want to call it, whereby someone is given permission by the mother to go in and kill her baby. And there are people, maybe half the country, certainly the entire Democratic Party, Democratic apparatus, most of the academic institutions, colleges and universities, the legal system, a lot of the majority of counselors, psychiatric and psychiatrists, they're all in favor of this. And so it's not fair to say nobody is for abortion. Yes, they are. And that's the problem. We live in a culture of death, and it's getting darker and darker and deadlier and deadlier. And this is serious. So these little word games of nobody's actually pro-abortion, yes, they are. And that's why we have to fight for life. We have to fight for the rights of the unborn to simply exist. You know, the left likes to say, well, certain groups are erased, or we don't recognize their existence. You know, we define them out of existence. Well, talk about being defined out of existence. The unborn child is basically treated as a nothing in this whole discussion. And so we need to bring the child back into the discussion and say, you cannot kill this child. This child is made in the image of God. You have no right to touch this child. Even if it's inside your own womb, you don't have the right.
And pro-life. Lila, you say some things in the predicate of your positions that life begins at fertilization, that science is very clear about that. And you have to know science isn't, there's no consensus among the scientific community.
There is, Dr. Phil. 96%
no, actually,
of scientists
not.
say that life begins at fertilization. If you're an in vitro specialist, you're looking to create
let me
a
finish.
single cell embryo, and then you know you have a new human life. So it is a scientific fact.
Well, actually, it's not.
When do you?
Okay, so Dr. Phil is trying to say that a single-celled individual, when the sperm meets the egg and there is a human life created, separate DNA, a unique individual person, he's trying to say, well, science has not actually said that that is the beginning of human life. Well, it's most certainly is the beginning of human life. And science textbooks will say that that's the beginning of life. What other life can it be? than human life. It has human DNA. If no one kills it or it doesn't die, then it will grow up to be an adult human being. It's not going to grow up to be a horse. It's not going to be a dog, a cat, a lizard. It's not going to grow up to be a tree. It's not going to grow up to be moss, grass. It's not going to grow up to be a virus, not a virus, but some kind of a tumor or some kind of a growth. It's not a clump of cells of the woman, because the woman has her own unique DNA because she's a human being and she's a person made in the image of God. She has her own unique human DNA. That fertilized egg does not have her unique DNA. It has a different DNA than hers. Hers and the male sperm combine to create a totally unique human being. So whatever that clump of cell is, it's living and it is human. So what more do you need to define human life than here is a living entity that has human DNA and it is growing, and it can become an adult if you just don't kill it. And if it doesn't die and we protect it, it will be an adult human being, just like Dr. Phil. So Dr. Phil has DNA. Lila Rose has a unique DNA. Everyone on this planet has a unique DNA. And that baby in the womb, even at the moment of conception, has a unique DNA. So you can't say it's not a human being, because it is a human being. It has DNA. It's alive. It's growing. There's nothing else you can call it.
When do you say human life begins then?
It doesn't matter what I think. I don't care what I think. What I'm saying is...
Okay, so he is correct. That reply from Lila Rose should have been actually phrased differently. She said, well, when do you believe human life begins? And he's absolutely correct. It doesn't really matter what he thinks. It doesn't matter what his opinion is. It's not what Dr. Phil thinks. It's actually what is actually the case. When does human life begin? So what she really meant was, okay, where do you think the line should be drawn? Because every single arbitrary line that's drawn after conception, after fertilization, is that totally arbitrary. Because you're then going further on. Someone else could say, well, I believe a 10-month-old child is a human being, and then anything before that is not a human being. And that would be totally arbitrary. You could say 3 years old would be the line I would draw. You could say that. And everything before that would not be human. It's totally arbitrary. So the only logical, rational, scientific, the only thing that makes sense is you say the moment that entity, that living being, comes into being with its own set of DNA, that is the moment that it becomes a living life. It becomes a human being. And that's still the only thing that makes any sense.
The scientific community does not have a consensus about when life begins.
It's simply inaccurate. It's simply inaccurate.
That's not true. You can go to the body
A single cell embryo is a unique new human life.
You can go to the body of scientific literature and you can find...
Okay, well then why doesn't he take us to the body of unique scientific literature? Why doesn't he take us there? Why doesn't he cite one authority? Why doesn't he quote one textbook? Why doesn't he quote one journal article? Why doesn't he quote one academic scientific source to back up his statement? And he's stating that there is no consensus on when human life begins. And He's giving us his subjective opinion. So that tells you a lot. If a person quotes and says, science says, we've heard this before, we've heard this, Dr. Fauci claims to speak for science, and science says this, and we've heard the phrase, follow the science, and you hear that from people all the time. Okay, well, give me a specific authority, consensus authority in science. Show me the literature. He says, go consult the literature. Which journal article? Which textbook? Give us concrete examples. Otherwise, you're just giving your opinion. Now, there is no consensus scientifically about personhood. But that's a whole separate issue, because in the scientific community, they like to think, well, we don't get into spiritual, religious, moral issues. We don't dare to say when a human life becomes a person. But he's talking about human life. He's talking about the biological existence of a human life, and that is crystal clear. It's at the moment of conception, and Lila Rose is totally right, because the consensus in the scientific community is that human life begins at conception, just like monkey life begins at monkey conception, and elephant life begins at elephant conception, and so on and so forth. So there is no other place to start other than conception, and Dr. Phil doesn't have an argument to counter that.
Neuroscientists who say that it begins when there is a detectable brainwave.
But Dr. Phil, in an abortion, if
No, he's talking about personhood. He is really confused. He is trying to bring in this personhood argument. I don't accept that whole personhood argument, because, again, you have a very arbitrary, subjective, opinionated dividing line. Okay, some people say when there's brainwave activities, then that's the first moment of personhood. Okay, but then again, there are human beings that don't have brainwave activity while they're in a coma or some other place, and so are they not persons? No, they may wake up, they may be revived from their coma and come out of that, and then they carry on with their life. So brainwave activity of a certain type is not the category that you can say beyond that is personhood, before that isn't. No, that's a false distinction. And then some others say this point, and then he'll go on and talk about quickening, when the baby moves, and that's when it becomes a person. He's talking about this whole abstract argument about personhood. Lila Rose is just saying human life biologically begins at conception. We're not getting into all of those philosophical and theological issues right at this moment. We're talking about raw biological life. Human life begins at conception. Case closed. Dr. Phil is just confused.
it's not a human life, why do you have to kill it?
I haven't spoken over you.
Okay, so that she said something very profound. If it's not a living human life, if it's not a life, then why is it so important to kill it? Right? If it's not living, if it's not growing, if it's not developing into a human life, then why would you have to take a radical step like having a procedure like abortion to stop it from growing and living and developing like all human beings do? Why would you have to do that? If it's just something, then just let it be. No, they kill it because it is going to be growing and developing like all human beings do, and they want to stop that process because they don't want that human being brought into the world for all these flimsy, foolish reasons. So Lila Rose is right on in pressing that point.
And you keep speaking over me, and I assume that's because you don't want me to finish my thought, which is, if anyone here wants to fact check me instead of speak over me, you can go to the scientific literature.
Which scientific literatures? Again, that's like saying, listen to the science. What are you talking about? Can you be more concrete? Can you be more definite? Just saying to people, go to the scientific literature, means nothing. Point them in the specific direction if you have some evidence. If you don't, you're just trying to smokescreen people.
And query what the definition is of the beginning of life, and you will find that there are different definitions. And it's up to you to decide what you think, but there...
Oh, really? Do we leave that up in the air to everyone? Like, for example, what is murder? Do we leave that up to the individual of each person to define what murder is? Maybe someone takes the life of someone else but says, well, you know, that's not murder. That's not what I believe murder is. Murder is this, and they give their own little subjective definition. And then another person says, no, murder is this, and they kill someone, but they kill them in a certain way, and it's not, it doesn't involve their direct contact with the person. And they say, well, I didn't murder the person. That person that I gave money to did. And they say, well, that's still, you're guilty of murder. Well, no, that's not the definition. No, we have definitions. And you don't leave it up to the individual to just define these important issues.
Is not a consensus among the scientific community, and it has actually evolved across time. Before we had sonograms, it was a black box what was going on in there. Then when we got to the point we had sonograms and we could see, oh, you can detect a heartbeat. Okay, now, up until then, it was referred to as quickening, when you could feel the kick. That was the beginning of life. And then we got better technology, and then it started to change. But you say it's...
So was there not human life all along when people didn't know there was human life? In other words, before quickening in the ancient times, maybe there was no way to detect that a growing human life was present. But are you saying there wasn't a growing life present because we couldn't detect it? So you're equating what we can detect with what really is. And so you're trying to make the argument, well, we didn't know about it, so it didn't exist. It's like a ostrich sticking its head in the sand and saying, there are no threats to me because I can't see any. No. The baby was growing in the womb before we could detect it and before quickening, obviously, right? We just didn't know it. So we have to adjust our thinking to, oh yeah, it was alive long before then. And then when you start getting medically accurate information about the human body, you realize, oh yeah, it was a human life all the way from conception. And that's where the science is right now.
Fertilization, but at fertilization, there actually hasn't been implantation. And then once...
Well, implantation is not the beginning of when the DNA, a unique DNA, is created. So it doesn't have to be implanted for there to be a unique human being in existence. It eventually has to implant for that human life to exist further on. But as far as a process and a stage, fertilization and conception occurs before implantation. So your argument doesn't follow.
There's implantation, then this is a process. And it's, all I'm saying is there's not a consensus. And you're saying there is, and that's factually inaccurate.
We can agree to disagree, but I will say, when I was
But
pregnant...
the literature doesn't disagree.
Well, what literature? Again, you're just spouting off. Well, science, that's not what science says. Well, tell us concretely, show us the textbook saying exactly what you're saying, and show us a number of textbooks and show us a number of journals and cite them and give us the page number and get some concrete information here. You can't go into court and say, well, the literature says this. Well, what literature? Science says this. What science? Yeah, you've got to give some evidence. You can't just say that the evidence is there. It's there. Yeah, it's somewhere. No. She's actually giving you a concrete argument, and you're giving her vague generalities.
We should look it up. It's 96% of scientists have agreed when surveyed. But regardless of that point, I think the question is, we know deep down when you're pregnant, there's a new human life. That's why it's so devastating for Nancy. Our miscarriage was so devastating. We all know that deep down. These are human beings. That's why it's so contentious. And listen, do we acknowledge that all humans have human rights? Because I think what your question is about
I
is about
agree with a lot of
personhood.
your points. I'm just saying it comes down to when that life begins.
But
and
I don't
that's all
think
I'm
Nancy
saying.
or others here are saying
Okay,
they're not
Chrissy, go
human
ahead.
beings.
The real argument here we're having is about choice and a person's right to choose what is best for them, regarding.
No, that's not the whole argument. This woman is totally getting off the total topic of Dr. Phil and Lila when they're discussing. It is not about human choice. It is about the status of the baby in the womb. You don't kill someone who is a human being. You don't have that right. God didn't give you that right. The Constitution doesn't give you that right. You're wanting to take that right because as sinful human beings, yeah, sure, if you don't like someone or you have an enemy in life, and if you could get away with killing them, a lot of sinful, evil, rebellious people would actually do that. And if the government then comes along and says you can do that, that's perfectly fine. They'll take it. But no, it does not come down to a human choice. It comes down to moral standards.
Family planning, what is best for them regarding their bodies and their ownership. And when we are listening to this debate, we're constantly getting it back to about who's deciding what. If you determine for yourself that's when life begins, that is not, well, we're not going to go any further with this because she's trying to introduce a whole new different subject, and that is you choose what's right for your body. What about the baby in the womb? What about the human being in the mother's womb? Doesn't that baby get to choose what's best for its body? No, you're choosing what's good for your body, and you're choosing death for the child. That is not morally acceptable. And so when we deal with these pro-choice, pro-abortion people, we need to bring them back to that question that Dr. Phil and Lila Rose were debating, and that is, what is the status of the baby in the womb? And again, Dr. Phil wants to say, well, it's so hard to know. We don't know when life begins. No, we do know when life begins. It begins when there is a unique DNA formed at conception, at fertilization. A totally unique individual human being is formed in the womb, and that is the only logical way that we can look at that. Well, I hope this has been helpful. I hope that it gets you thinking, because we need to think about these things, and we'll see you back next week on another edition. God bless.